This lecture is relatively long, and so I have included this outline so that you can have an easier time following along. Now, I'm going to be showing you a lot of data in this lecture, and I want to make something clear. You are not responsible for knowing all of the statistics I'm about to show you. The data that I'm going to show you is meant to illustrate the points you see here in the outline. Look at number 2 there. It says how the U.S. is different. Inequality, size of government, constitutional design. I'm going to show you data on each of those 3 things. But the point that I want you to get from the data is that the United States is different when it comes to inequality, size of government, and constitutional design. I won't be asking you questions about specific statistics. They're just included here to make a point. And that's the point, how the United States is different. Imagine you're standing in a long line somewhere, maybe at the registrar's office or financial aid or the bookstore, or anywhere really. And let's imagine your phone isn't working because this doesn't work otherwise. So you're standing in a long line and you're bored, and so you strike up a conversation with someone in line next to you. And that's why it's important for your phone not to be working, because nobody talks to people anymore if they have their phone. So you're standing in line, you're talking to the person in line next to you, and this person is in the United States for the very first time. I mean, this is their first day in the United States. They arrived at the airport and came straight to wherever you are, and they're standing in line with you. And this person asks you this question: what's America like? How would you answer that question? I used to give this question as an assignment to my classes, to a writing assignment. And I still do sometimes. I ask my students this question in class. And repeatedly, I found something interesting, an interesting pattern in the answers that my students have given me. After asking my students the question, what's America like? I asked my students if this was an easy question to answer or a difficult question to answer. And I kept track of how people answered that question. 54% of my American students who were born in the United States, said this was an easy question to answer. But 89% of international students who were not born in the United States, said this was an easy question to answer. And that's sort of counterintuitive. You'd expect Americans to say it's easier to answer the question because they've lived here all their lives. They should know more about the country. Why is it that international students say that this is an easier question to answer than American students do? Well, the answer has to do with something about the United States, and that is Americans tend not to know a lot about the rest of the world. Americans often don't have anywhere else to compare to. Whereas international students, by definition, coming from somewhere else, have at least one other place that they can compare the United States to. And that gets to the point of this lecture. If you really want to understand really almost anything, but especially government and politics in the United States, it helps to have something to compare to. My area of specialization in political science is something called comparative politics, which essentially is the study of similarities and differences between countries. I have found from studying comparative politics that I have learned a lot about American government and politics by having other countries to compare the United States to. And so what I want to do in this particular lecture is show you how the United States compares to other democracies around the world. Now, before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit more about why it is that Americans don't know so much about the rest of the world. One reason for this is simple geography. Here's a map of the United States. Imagine you're put down right in the middle of the country. So, say right there. Uh, that's actually the geographic center of the continental United States. It's just outside of a town called Lebanon, Kansas. Now imagine you're sitting there in the middle of the country and someone tells you to drive 500 miles in any direction. Where are you when you're done? Well, this is what a 500-mile radius around the very center of the continental United States looks like. When you're done driving 500 miles in any direction, you're still in the United States. The United States is a very big country geographically, and we're only bordered by two other countries, Canada and Mexico. So it makes sense that the United States and people in the United States have less direct experience, less direct exposure to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is far away. This isn't the case with other parts of the world. This is Europe, and let's say someone puts you down in the middle of Europe, or at least in the middle of Western Europe. So, say in the middle of Switzerland, right here. And again, you drive 500 miles in any direction. Well, you're going to go through a whole lot of different countries. Here's how many. There's the 500-mile radius, and this is how many countries are within 500 miles. 20 different countries within 500 miles of the center of Europe, that spot in Switzerland. So, in other parts of the world, the rest of the world is closer. If you are in one of these countries in Europe, you probably do know something about other countries because they're closer to you. It's sort of like the dynamic in the United States between states. If you're in Georgia, you may know something about what's going on in Florida or Tennessee or Alabama next door. Well, that distance to the next state in the United States is the distance to the next country in other parts of the world. Again, to give you a comparison, here's another map of Europe, and here's a map of the United States overlaid on the map of Europe. The United States is about the size of the entire continent of Europe. So again, when we're talking about the United States, we're talking about a much bigger place. And it's easier to live your whole life without leaving the United States. The state of Georgia. Here is the Netherlands and Belgium in Europe. And that's the size of the state of Georgia. So just the state of Georgia is the size of those two countries. It's actually larger than those two countries combined. So Americans tend not to know a whole lot about the rest of the world oftentimes. But what we do know, and the comparisons that we do make, often have an interesting pattern also. Let me show you a statistic comparing different countries. And this one has to do with homicide. This is a comparison of the homicide rate in different countries. This is the number of murders per 100,000 people. For every 100,000 people in the country, how many murders are there? And if you look at the top of the list, you see countries that have a relatively high homicide rate. Now look at the very bottom. There's the United States. So the murder rate in the United States compared to these other countries is fairly low and dramatically lower compared to the countries at the top of the list. Take a look at the countries on the list. Besides the United States, you may notice a pattern. And that is the countries that are included on this particular list are countries that tend to be less democratic or less wealthy than the United States. And in many cases, both. Less democratic and less wealthy. And those are the countries that the United States is often compared to by Americans. We like to compare the United States to the poorest, least democratic countries in the world. I'm not sure why Americans like to do that. Maybe it makes us feel good about ourselves. But that's what we often do. We often compare ourselves to countries that are very different from the United States in terms of the type of government and the type of economy. Let me show you this statistic again, but instead of looking at the United States compared to less democratic and less wealthy countries, we'll compare the United States only to countries that are also very democratic and also very wealthy. You'll notice the murder rate is the same for the United States as on the previous slide, same data. But now, instead of being dramatically lower than the other countries, the United States is dramatically higher than the other countries. And the difference is, on the previous slide, we're comparing the United States to countries that are less democratic and poorer, whereas on this slide, we're comparing the United States to other rich democratic countries. When you do that, when you compare the United States to countries that are similar to the United States in terms of wealth, in terms of the kind of government that they have, what we find is that the differences between the United States and other rich democratic countries are smaller than the differences between the United States and poor, less democratic countries. But they actually tell us more. The difference between the murder rate in the United States and in these other rich democratic countries is smaller, but it tells us a lot more. Compared to other countries that are also rich and democratic, the United States has an unusually high murder rate. Why is that? Well, that's the sort of thing that we're going to be looking at in this lecture. I'm going to show you the data that compares the United States to other countries that are also wealthy and also democratic, like the United States. We're fairly similar to these countries, but even compared to countries that are similar to us, the United States is often what we call an outlier. We don't follow the same pattern that these other democracies that are also wealthy seem to exhibit. So what I want to show you is the United States compared to other countries that are wealthy and democratic, like the United States, and how even compared to those countries, the United States is different. I'm going to show you data from a number of different sources. Some of this data comes from the United Nations. Some comes from an organization called the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is an organization of rich countries that basically puts out data for people like me who study this sort of stuff. Some of the data comes from the World Bank. Some comes from a project called the World Values Survey. And the data I'm going to show you compares the United States to other countries that we call developed democracies. This means the other rich democratic countries. And this definition, this name, has two different parts. The developed part refers to economics, where the democracy part refers to the kind of government that the country has. So when we're talking about a developed country, we're talking about countries that are wealthy, that are capitalist, that have a high standard of living. These are rich countries like the United States. Now, capitalism works differently in different parts of the world, but all of these countries are wealthy. All of these countries have capitalist economies that are based on buying and selling things in a market. And all of these countries have a high standard of living. The democracy part of it refers to politics and government. All of these countries that we call developed democracies have respect for basic political rights, what we would call civil rights and civil liberties. So things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion and all of those things we think of as part of a democracy, these countries have that. They also have free and fair elections. You have a democratically elected government. People have the right to vote. Elections are free and fair, and for the most part, there's not corruption in the electoral system. Now, it's possible to be a rich country without being a democracy, and it's possible to be a democracy without being a rich country. So, for example, China is generally considered developed. It's a wealthy country, but its government is not democratic. On the other hand, India is a democracy, but most people who study this sort of thing would say that it's not quite wealthy enough to be considered developed yet. We're looking at countries that are both developed and democracies. So which countries are we talking about here? Well, there's no official list of these countries, but if you ask people who study comparative politics, they'll give you generally the same 10, 20, 30 countries. Um, Most of us who study this stuff agree on which countries we're talking about. There are a few countries that some people would say are developed democracies and others would say are not, but there are about 20 or 25 countries that everybody agrees are developed democracies. So, for example, Canada, the United States, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. And most people who study this sort of thing would say South Korea is now a developed democracy. Additionally, most of the countries in Western Europe are considered developed democracies. So countries like Britain and France and Germany, Italy and Spain, Sweden, Norway, Ireland, all of these countries are considered by most people who study this stuff to be developed democracies.